All right, hello. Welcome to the next morning session of the Deep Learning and Reinforcement Learning Summer School, the CIFAR Deep Learning and Reinforcement Learning Summer School. It is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Saxe. Andrew and I actually go back some ways. I think I first met Andrew when he was doing his PhD at Stanford University under the supervision of Jay McCullen, Surya Ganguly, Andrew Ng, and Christoph Schreiner. So quite a group of advisors there. Back in those days, you could fit the entire deep learning research community in a small to medium conference room. And I think it's one of those conference rooms actually where I met Andrew. But he's come a long way. So the community's come a long way since then, and so has he. He's now the Sir Henry Dale Fellow in the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford. And his research interests are the focus on the theory of deep learning and its applications to neuroscience and psychology. And today he's going to be giving us an introduction to deep learning theory. So with that, we're going to start his video now. He's like our other speakers, he's live with us here. So as his video plays, he's going to be able to answer any kind of questions you have along the way. And then again, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for a live discussion. And if you'd like to ask questions at the end, I'd appreciate if you could just use the raise hand function on Zoom here. All right, so with that, let's begin.
Welcome, everybody, to this lecture on deep learning theory. So the jumping off point here is the fact that deep neural networks work incredibly well, but in many ways, we don't really understand why they work or when they will work. And in some sense, you could say, well, actually, we understand them perfectly, because if you look inside a deep neural network, we understand every single transformation that's happening. We know if you look at a single neuron, what it's computing, and we can give an explicit program that a computer can execute completely by rote that will implement one of these deep learning algorithms. So they are transparent systems, and yet I think most of us are left with a sense that often they surprise us in terms of what they do. But given that they have this transparency, do we really need theory? And what are the goals of theory for the field? My view on this is that a lot of the questions surrounding theory have to do with the idea of emergence. So you can define a deep neural network by the data that you're going to feed it, the architecture that it has, and the learning algorithm that you're going to run on it. And those are fairly transparent, but then they have these complex interactions we don't really understand, this black box here, and then out at the end of training pops, the training speed, the internal representations, the generalization performance, and these are the metrics we care about in the performance of the system. And the task of theory is to formalize relationships between these quantities on the left and the resulting the results of the experiment on the right. And if we were able to formalize some of these relationships and get some understanding of these systems, it would have a number of benefits. So first, turning to engineering applications. When you understand a system, that's usually when you can start to control it to improve performance. And we'll see some small examples of that in this talk. Another big focus of theory is to provide performance guarantees. So you can sleep easy at night knowing that a bridge is not going to fall down because of performance guarantees that you can provide for that system. And we'd like to do the same for learning devices. How can we guarantee aspects of their performance? And beyond engineering, I come from theoretical neuroscience. I think it's clear that deep learning has revolutionized the practice of engineering. It could also revolutionize our understanding of the brain sciences if the brain is doing something like deep learning. But in order for it to do so, we really do need to understand these systems, because explanation is usually a first-level goal of science. It's the whole point. It's not only about improved performance. And in particular, when you understand a system, I think that's when you can start coming up with predictions that are distinctive of different hypotheses that would actually let you falsify them empirically, right? Because the question is, how could we falsify the theory that the brain is doing something like deep learning? To be able to answer that, we really have to understand these systems. Let me start with a whirlwind history tour, just highlighting some of the ways that theory has impacted the field. So we can start with the perceptron. This is a single neuron learning introduced by the psychologist Frank Rosenblatt. And there was a lot of hype when this single neuron was introduced. So here's an article from the New York Times saying that it's going to eventually be conscious of its existence. So that was a lot of hype. And that all came to an end with the publication of this book by Minsky and Papert, which showed that perceptrons cannot solve the XOR task. And again, so the point here is that this was actually a theory result that changed the course of the field in a major way. This is a proof that it doesn't matter what learning algorithm you use, there's just no way for a single neuron to solve the exclusive OR task. And then a little bit later, we had the backpropagation algorithm. The idea behind backpropagation was discovered by a variety of people before this, but this paper was really the first to sort of popularize it and show how it could overcome the limitations of the single neuron perceptron by adding multiple layers of nonlinear transformations. And one thing I love about this field is how interdisciplinary it is. So if you look at these affiliations, David Rumelhart is one of the most famous psychologists of the past century. Geoffrey Hinton, of course, one of the most famous computer scientists at the moment, and Ronald Williams. So there's been a long history of collaborations here. And if you're coming from computer science, you don't know who David Rumelhart is, he's definitely worth a Google. And so people rapidly tried to formalize these results and why these deeper networks were overcoming previous limitations. And this sort of ended in a bunch of universal approximation theorems. And they're so classic that I just want to sort of describe one so you can at least see what the content looks like. Here's one from Barron in 1993. And it basically says, suppose you give me a function, f of x, and the input is going to be d-dimensional. And I'm going to try to approximate that function by setting all the weights in a single layer sigmoidal neural network described by the input-output function fn of x, where n is the number of hidden neurons. And I could compare how well my network is doing by basically computing the squared error between the target function and the network's output averaged over some region of the input. Okay, and that's what that integral is saying. It's saying that that integrated square error is going to decay as 1 over n, where n is the number of neurons, again, in that neural network. So that's quite fast. If you want to get a low approximation error, once you have a bunch of neurons in that layer, you're going to be doing pretty well. This is it's a beautiful result in this direction. And an amazing feature of it is d, the input dimensionality, does not appear in this expression. Right? So the ability to adjust all the parameters in this network allow the approximation error to very rapidly improve. And you can sort of formalize this aspect of it. You could call it a feature learning advantage or an adaptable basis advantage. So you can show also that no linear combination of n fixed basis functions will yield a squared error on all possible target functions that's smaller than the order of 1 over n to the 2 over d. So now you can see in that version of the bound where you're not allowed to adapt essentially input to hidden layer weights. You're using just fixed functions. You can't learn representations. That the approximation error suffers from recursive dimensionality. Basically saying as input dimension grows, adapting representations really is essential. This is a beautiful way of formalizing these intuitions. But approximation theorems are just about what a network can represent in principle. It doesn't say whether you can learn those representations using gradient descent from a finite set of data. And indeed, we know that training these deep networks is non-convex. You're often going to find training dynamics get stuck in local minima, at least if you use small networks. And so these considerations, again, theoretical considerations, I think were underlying a lot of the interest in sort of the next big wave of machine learning methods, which were kernel methods. And the advantage of kernel methods is they were a convex formulation of the learning problem. It could still solve the XOR task, but you could have these beautiful, strong performance guarantees. So that was another big focus. Kernel methods still around, continuing focus of machine learning. And again, I think it's an element of theory there that's sort of been pulling the field in these different directions. And now as we enter the deep learning era, this is really based on an empirical observation that large deep networks work well. And even though they might be a non-convex learning problem, this doesn't seem to be a major hurdle to obtaining good performance in practice. And this poses a whole bunch of theoretical questions that we'd like answers to. Here's a paper just listing a few questions. For instance, why don't heavily parameterized neural networks overfit the data? What is the effective number of parameters in these networks? Why doesn't backpropagation head for a poor local minimum? Now, these are very timely questions today. But this paper is from 1995 by the statistician Leo Bremen. It's a very nice paper to read. And I just bring this up to say that theory has a very long history, even in nonlinear deep neural networks. The questions are quite old, and looking back to that history, there's a lot to learn. A lot has already been done. So moving forward to today, what I'm going to talk about is theory, a few vignettes of theory in a particular tradition. And so theory is a huge field, and you could approximately break things down into this following classification, but there are tons of exceptions to this, so take it with a grain of salt. But there's sort of a mathematics computer science tradition, which emphasizes rigorous proofs and tends to focus on worst case performance. So it's the sort of knowledge you need to guarantee performance in an engineering context. And then there's also a physics theoretical neuroscience tradition, which tends to emphasize typical performance. So not the worst case, but if you just run an algorithm on an, get a typical average learning curve out, what will that look like? And physics and theoretical neuroscience often make use of strong assumptions and idealized models. You'll see that, some examples of that as I go forward. So these are just a bunch of references that will let you get stuck into these different perspectives. And there are, of course, lots of connections between these. So really, they're not so different. There's lots of links between them, but this is sort of a broad overview of some of the strands of theory that are out there. So to be more specific, we'd like a theory that could have some practical answers for questions that we care about. For instance, suppose I double the depth of a network. How much longer will it take to train? Right, so here we're plotting the number of layers in the network on the x-axis. As I make a network deeper, would I expect the training time to stay flat with depth? Or maybe it will increase linearly, or maybe it goes exponentially slow in depth. What does that look like? Another question we could ask is, suppose I train several networks on the same task, but from different random initial weights. What would I have to do to cause them to have similar internal representations, such that the training process was in some sense reliable? So that's another question we could ask. And a third motivating question, here I'm training a neural network on a task, and you can see its training error in blue decreases almost to 0, but its test error eventually turns around and starts heading back up. It's got this generalization gap at long training times. And a question you might ask is, if I increase or decrease the number of examples, will this reduce the generalization gap? So we'd like theories that can shed light on these questions. And today, I'll present a few vignettes of attempts to answer these questions. First, I'll talk about training dynamics. Then I'll turn to internal representations. Finally, I'll talk about overparameterization and generalization performance, and then close with some comments about where things might be going. So first, training error. We know that depth complicates learning dynamics. For instance, here is a shallow network. It has 0 hidden layers, just inputs flowing through tunable weights to output. And I can train this network on a particular task. And here you can see it just exhibits these simple learning curves. Their exponential approach to zero error. Everything looks pretty straightforward. But if I instead add a bunch of layers to this network, train it on the exact same task, the deep network shows long plateaus followed by rapid transitions to lower error solutions. And you can see in general is a much more complex learning process. It also unfolds over a longer period of time. So we'd like to understand these dynamics. And the model that I'm going to use is a simple model. So this is a strategy of surrogates saying we can't study the full complexity of nonlinear deep networks. We're going to find a tractable subproblem that can hopefully get to the overall case. So what is a deep linear neural network? Well, here's a deep neural network. We have inputs coming in over on the right here, flowing through weighted synaptic connections, layers of them. And at each layer, we're applying some nonlinearity, pointwise nonlinearity, f. And that's really what makes theory hard to do, right? Some complicated nonlinear function. So we can start with something pretty drastic and just strip out all of the nonlinearities. And this is a deep linear network that we can use as a starting point. So in a deep linear network, the mapping from the input x to the output of the network y hat is just going to be a product of a bunch of weight matrices. There's no activation function. It's just a deep network with no activation function. And so you might be thinking, well, hold on a second. The composition of linear maps is still linear. So I could just multiply out all these matrices and come up with one single total weight matrix that is a shallow network that implements the exact same thing. And this is true. So these deep linear networks, as you add additional layers, you don't get any more representational power. But in some sense, this isolates the impact of depth because all this network has is layered structure, right? It doesn't have any other nonlinearities or influences. And so we'll be able to see the specific impact of depth on learning dynamics. And you might think, well, surely, since you could rewrite these networks as a shallow network, they're going to not do anything particularly interesting. But in fact, they have remarkably interesting learning trajectories. For instance, here's a deep linear network. You can see it does basically nothing for a while before eventually bumping down towards slower error. And it shows phenomena like faster training from unsupervised pre-training initial conditions. So the hope is that by studying the linear case, we can understand the basis of some of these phenomena in the nonlinear case. So why are these networks giving interesting behavior? Well, it's important to be clear on what is and is not linear here. So when I say it's a deep linear network, I'm referring to the mapping from the input vectors x to the predictions of the network y hat. That's linear. But now to do learning, we're going to put that into a loss or error function. So here I'm always going to be using the squared error between some desired target patterns and the network's output for those target patterns. And this is where nonlinearity has re-entered the problem. And now to do learning, we have to minimize this nonlinear error function. And if you look at this for a while, you'll see it's actually non-convex once you have one or more hidden layers. So this is a little petri dish. It's a model that retains one key feature of the nonlinear networks, and that is non-convexity. So if we just take the derivatives of that loss function, you get the gradient descent dynamics. And these are the gradient descent equations. This is just standard backprop. If you apply backprop, in PyTorch or whatever on a deep linear network, this is what equivalent to that. And I just want to make a few points here. So the first is that these equations are nonlinear. You can see up to cubic interactions between all of the weight matrices here. And the second point is that they're coupled. So to know how to change the weights at layer L, I need to know all of the other weight matrices. And this is a key feature of deep networks, this coupling across many layers. And a final point is that the only way that the data set enters is through the input correlations and the input-output correlations. So this is a feature just of deep linear networks, but you don't need to know everything about the input data. All you need to know is input correlations and the input-output correlations. And what this means is our goal will be to solve these dynamics, to understand how training proceeds as a function of the statistics in the data set, as specified by these input correlations and input-output correlations. Now, there's lots of prior work on deep linear networks. Baldi and Hornick worked out critical point structure. The shallow dynamics have been studied. Three-layer dynamics have been studied. The thing that this is really going to be adding is an analysis that applies to much deeper networks, so we can investigate the impact of depth. All right, so how can we understand these dynamics? Well, we're going to use a change of variables. It's a very particular change of variables that happens to simplify the dynamics considerably. So let me explain how this works. Across the top here, I have the data set provided by the world, and I've just made it up by hand as an example here. So this data set has 4 items, a bird, a fish, a tree, and a flower, and they all have a bunch of properties that the network is supposed to produce as this output. And so this matrix is the input-output correlation matrix for this data set. And I can break that down into the product of 3 matrices. So this is using the singular value decomposition. And the singular value decomposition sort of decomposes this matrix into a series of modes. And a mode links together a bunch of items with these right singular vectors to a bunch of features that those items possess, the left singular vectors, and the strength of that association is the singular value, which is this element on the diagonal. So you can see that the first mode is what's common to all of the items, and that's mostly that they all can grow. The second mode splits off the animals from the plants, and that they are distinguished by whether they can move or have roots, and so on down the tree. And the strength of these associations is given by these singular values along the diagonal. So what we're going to do is analyze the neural network in the same reference frame. We change variables by putting in this U and V transpose matrices, the left and right singular vectors. But the network is going to have its own effective singular values that won't necessarily be the same value as in the overall data set. When the network knows nothing, they'll start off at approximately 0, and then they'll increase over training to the correct value in the environment. And I just want to note, we're not building in the answer here. Sometimes it might seem like that, but we're computing the gradient descent dynamics, and after we've done that, we're just using a rotation, so a change of basically a different lens to look at these dynamics where things simplify. And you'll see, at the beginning of training, these networks really do know nothing. And so we're not building in knowledge to these networks in this analysis. All right, so here's sort of an example of what the dynamics look like. You can see all of these effective singular values. They're starting off at 0. The network's just outputting 0 to begin with. And then over the course of training, they're going to pop up to the correct values in the data set. And as they do, they refine the input-output map of the network. So what this is saying is essentially deep linear networks, their training dynamics evolve so that at each point in time, the deep linear network is doing essentially a time-dependent SVD. And the trajectory is governed by the trajectory of these effective singular values on the diagonal here. And importantly, we can give explicit equations that tell how these effective singular values are going to evolve over time. And I won't go through the details of those equations. I'll just plot them here for you. And they have pretty interesting structure. So in a shallow network where you don't have any hidden layers, all you're going to see is exponential approach to the final correct value in the data set. Whereas once you go to the deep networks, you see very qualitatively different dynamics. You get a sigmoidal shape where you have this long period where it doesn't really learn much, and a relatively brief transition to the asymptotic value for that singular effective singular value in the environment. And when you go to very deep networks, it doesn't change all that much. It just sort of lengthens this initial period, and it's not quite symmetric in the transition. Okay, now the surprising piece of this analysis, the reason why the SVD is a useful change of variables, is that each of these effective singular values evolves independently of the rest. So it manages to decouple these equations. And that's a key simplification. So you can think about each one, just don't have to worry about what all the rest are doing. And what that means is if you have a network with lots of different modes, you just think of what each one is doing individually and sum it together, and you get what the overall network is doing. So here, for instance, trained on that hierarchical data set, you would first see the largest singular value pop up, and then the next, and then the next, and so on. And the analysis that I've shown you relies on certain technical assumptions. So in red here, I'm showing you that simulated networks starting from small random weights really do match these solutions quite accurately. All right, so now that we've got these solutions, we can, these specify how the network learns the task. We could write down equations that describe how all the weights evolve, and you can ask a variety of questions, right, once you've got these solutions. And an important one is training speed. How will this scale with depth? And the result that emerges is that the time difference for learning a very deep network compared to a shallow network is roughly on the order of 1 over b to the d. And this b naught parameter here is related to the initial effective layer weight on a particular mode. So you can think of it as basically the initialization scale. So this is a fundamental prediction that deep learning speed cares immensely about initial conditions. Because if this b naught parameter is small, then when I raise it to the power of d, I'm going to be going exponentially slowly in depth. But if b naught is approximately equal to 1, 1 to the d is still 1. And so training would actually not be that slow, even in very deep neural networks. This is really a formalization of the vanishing gradient and its effect on training speed in deep networks. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of the flip side of that coin. If the gradient vanishes, you're not going to train quickly. So this lets us be quite explicit about the effect of initialization. If you start with small random weights, then you're going to scale exponentially slowly in depth, as I just mentioned. You'd be on this curve here. If you're doing pre-training and fine-tuning, then essentially you have to do D pre-training steps, because you have to pre-train however many layers of the network you have. So that's going to be scaling with the depth of the network. But then after that, it turns out that learning is going to be fast. So that scales roughly linearly with depth. But this also, this sort of theoretical result says, hey, you know what? If you can explicitly initialize your networks so that b naught equals 1, which corresponds to an orthogonal initialization, then you would predict depth-independent training times. And you'd get this flat curve. So deep networks are quite sensitive to their initialization. And this is one somewhat practical outcome of these theoretical results, saying there's potentially this initialization scheme that could speed up training in deep networks. All right, so to go to this first question that we asked, if I double the depth of the network, how much longer will it take to train? We've seen that we can get any of these three curves depending on the initialization scheme we use. I think we have some understanding of when you'll be in each regime. And just as an example of how these orthogonal initializations can speed learning, here on the left in red, we have scaled orthogonal initializations in a depth 10 network, training to 0 error on MNIST in about 200 epochs. And here's a depth 100 network, also training to almost 0 error in about 200 epochs. And other work has shown that this works at much deeper depths. And I just want to say that when you go to nonlinear systems, orthogonal is not the only thing. You also have to scale up the weights. And the scale factor, there's a well worked out theory for what that scale factor should be. This has also been extended to a bunch of different architectures. So now I'd say that we have a really mature theory of signal propagation in these networks that can sort of tell you what the initialization is that will allow learning to proceed quickly, even in extremely deep networks with really arbitrary nonlinearities. All right, so to summarize training dynamics, I've shown that depth itself strongly impacts learning dynamics. And initially, when I started working on these problems, I thought that it was really about neural nonlinearities. Sigmoids would saturate, this would slow learning. But here we've seen, in fact, just the fact of having layered structure can introduce sigmoidal learning trajectories and long plateaus. And these are all arising from a non-convexity in the loss surface, but they're saddle points, not local minima. So there's nothing that can really go catastrophically wrong here. It just might take a while to get to a good solution. And there's a lot of work, it's sort of beautiful work looking at this idea that saddle points may be more of an issue than local minima in very large networks. And we've seen that training speed can depend critically on initialization. There's a lot more work in this area. Sometimes depth can even speed up learning. You can look at the dynamics of second order methods, and you can look at the dynamics of generalization, just to highlight a few other interesting works in this area. All right, now let's turn to internal representations. So a motivation for deep learning is that you can learn intermediate representations that are particularly suited to a particular task, right? That's sort of the promise of deep learning methods. And they often take a relatively tabula rasa approach where they say, look, we don't want to build in too much structure. We want structure to be learned. We want all the sequence of feature transformations in these networks to be learned for a particular task. But this then raises the question, if you train on a particular task, what representations do networks learn? And are they really capable of representing complex implicit structures in your data set, like maybe an implicit hierarchy? So to look at this, I'm also going to use the deep linear network model, but in a way that's a little less intuitive if you come from a classification background. So what I'm going to do is have a bunch of different input items, like maybe you can think of it as a dog, a horse, a rabbit, okay? So lots of different individual input items, coded as one-hot vectors. And I run this through a deep linear network, and I'm going to have the network predict the properties that those items have. So if it sees a dog, it's supposed to say, oh, the dog is big, it can move, it can bark, and so on. And the network's supposed to predict these properties. So in contrast to a standard classification scheme where you usually have complex features and you're trying to classify them into individual options, we sort of have the flip of that. This would be like you start with the classified items, and now you're trying to map them to the complex properties that they have. So that's the setting that we're looking at here. This is a simple model where we could start to see how neural networks will come to represent complexly structured domains. And in order to represent structure, I'm going to turn to graphical models. So I'm going to say, suppose the world really is coming from some generative model with a particular structure. I could draw a data set of items and their properties from that generative model, and then I could feed it to a deep linear network. And this will now let us ask how structure in the world is imparted and represented in the deep linear network. And the crucial element here is that if we go to the limit of infinite data, then for lots of generative model structures, we can calculate the SVD of the data that's coming out analytically. And because of that, we don't need to do any simulations. We can sort of directly say how the structure will be learned based on the results that I showed you in the training dynamics section. So here are some examples of this. Across the top row here, I have the generative model. Here is, for instance, the items are just grouped into 3 clusters, and so on. And then in the next row, I'm showing the resulting covariance matrix of the items' properties, how similar they are. So you can see that they cluster in the cluster case. And then I'm showing the singular vectors. So this is how the neural network will break down this domain. And what you can see is that in the clustering case, you get block diagonal covariance matrices. And that means that the singular vectors will pick out the cluster structure appropriately. And then if I plot the evolving a 2D embedding of the network's input-output map over training, what you'll see is that the items separate out into 3 distinct clusters in the internal representations of this network. And a more complicated case, you have this tree. This yields ultrametric structure in this covariance matrix, which we know are diagonalized by the Haar wavelets. And so again, without having to simulate it, this gives us insight into how neural networks represent tree structured information, and they're going to elaborate out the tree in their internal representations. Chain and ring has circulant structure, which is diagonalized by the Fourier transform, and so on. So even though we never had to explicitly tell the network about these different structures, its natural implicit biases allow it to encode these structures suitably. And to take the hierarchy example in a little more detail, suppose you have a bunch of items. Maybe these are the natural kinds. You're learning about natural things. They have an implicit hierarchy behind them, like animals and plants, fish and bird. This would impart, as I said before, an ultrametric structure on these correlations. You get sort of blocks within block structure. And the neural network is going to learn about that by doing the SVD on this input-output correlations, which is just Haar wavelets. And you can see that these different distinctions correspond exactly to hierarchical distinctions in the tree. So first you learn what's common to everything, then you split off the next level of the tree, and so on. And the singular values are a decreasing function of hierarchy level for a certain class of hierarchical generative models. And what this means is that the network is going to exhibit progressive differentiation. It's going to start with the top level distinction in the tree and slowly elaborate out in these waves of sort of differentiation where you get these sigmoidal transitions. So to show how this looks, here I'm going to be showing the effective singular values in the networks. You see them popping up on their sigmoidal trajectories. And on the right, I'll show you the evolving 2D embedding of the neural representations in this network. And you can see that as each effective singular value comes online, it elaborates out one more distinction in the internal representations of these neural networks. All right, so now we can ask another question. Given that we have some insight into these internal representations, we can ask, what happens if I train two different networks on the same task, but starting from small random weights? Well, if you look at the neural tuning, so here I just created a data set with 4 different items, 32 neurons. If you look at individual neurons, they're tuning to these items. There's no real pattern, and you just have to trust me. There's no way you could permute these neuron numbers to get things to line up between these two networks. So at the level of individual neurons, that doesn't look like much is shared. But if you instead look at the correlations between the entire population activity vectors for these different items, shown in this matrix here, now these correlation matrices match exactly. And in fact, the neural correlations, so what you measure in this hidden layer, are also going to mirror the behavioral correlations of the desired output of the network. So this is an invariant of learning if you can calculate these neural correlations. And mathematically, I think it's quite interesting what's going on. So you can look at what's happening in these two weight matrices in different neural networks trained on the same task. And essentially, some piece of these weight matrices is fixed by the environment. So A, V, and U are just coming from the singular value decomposition of the environmental input-output statistics. So those are a public language that all networks trained on the same task will share. But then there's also this freedom in internal representations, denoted by this matrix R, which is essentially saying, well, you could swap any two hidden neurons, or in fact, you have any orthogonal transformation that would allow individual networks to represent things in different ways, but they'll still have to share this overall similarity structure. And you might think, well, isn't this trivial? I mean, is there any other way you could solve this task than having your neural correlations match and match the behavioral correlations? But in fact, there are many other ways that you can solve these tasks. This is not at all a necessary condition. So this consistency only arises when you start with small random weights, when you're in what's otherwise known as the feature learning regime, the rich regime. If you start with large random weights, you essentially have really strong features there from the start, and you no longer are going to have reliable matches in neural correlations. And these won't also match the behavioral correlations you're meant to produce, but all 4 of these networks are doing the task. They do the task perfectly. They get 0 training error. All right, so we can go to our second question I posed. If I train multiple networks on the same task, when would they yield similar internal representations? Well, for deep linear networks, at least one condition is when you start them off with small random weights, but maybe not with large random weights. A final aspect we can study of these internal representations is how they would let you make one-shot generalizations that would conform to structures that you've already learned about. So suppose you already learned about hierarchy in the world, and now you're learning one new fact, like that a dog has property X. How are you going to extend that fact across the rest of the data set? So this is a simple model of one-shot generalization or transfer learning. And what the network is going to do is essentially take that new property X and give it a representation in the internal layer of the network that's similar to whatever item it was associated to. So say the dog. And if you did this early in learning, the dog might be positioned here. If you do this late in learning, the dog is positioned here. And then the similarity, the extent that you extend this to other items is going to follow the distance in the hidden layer to the other items. And what this means is when early in learning, all of the items are similar to each other. So if I give the property to this item over here on this tree on the left, it's going to extend that item to all items. So it thinks that everything is going to have it. But then after the first wave of differentiation between, say, animals and plants, now it's limiting its generalization just to the animals. And it keeps elaborating it out until at the end of training, you can see that its generalization exactly conforms to the tree structure. And this is, I think, quite interesting. It's showing how similarity-based generalization can still exactly conform to an underlying structural form without having explicit built-in structure in the network. And you might be wondering what the effect of internal similarity is. I said small random weights lead to reliable similarity structure, large random weights don't. So if you were to do this starting from large random weights, you get very different sort of patterns of generalization. This network is getting 0 training error on the hierarchy, but is not able to effectively transfer its knowledge. So this is some hint as to why you would want to be in this small random weights feature learning regime, where the representations of the network are sort of reflecting the structure that's out there in the world. All right, so to summarize this piece on internal representations, I've shown that deep linear networks can represent and generalize implicit structures that are in the data set that you feed them. And interestingly, they do this without needing to explicitly set a candidate set of different structures. And I think deep neural networks in general, to an extent that's much greater than in most learning algorithms, they rely on these complex interactions between architecture, data, and algorithm in order to impart inductive biases. And at least for deep linear networks, the bias is very clear. It's a low-rank constraint. If you stop training early, you're going to learn just sort of the top k singular values that are in your data set. And this low-rank constraint arises from the combination of depth, small initialization, and gradient descent dynamics. So if you change those features of the setup, for instance, by starting with large initializations, then you can get extremely different behavior. It would be a different type of inductive bias. All right, now let's turn to overparameterization and generalization. So this is based on what was, at the time, quite a shocking observation, that as far as we can tell, if you make neural networks bigger, they just seem to work better. And the size of these networks could be way larger than the size of the data sets you're running them on, and they still seem to work just fine. So here's one example of this from this nice paper, where they said, we're going to look at the accuracy on ImageNet of a bunch of different neural networks, and the size of the circles that are plotted here is proportional to the number of parameters. So these very big circles here have 155 million parameters, even though they're trained on just 1.2 million examples, and yet they're generalizing pretty well. So what's going on here? And more systematically, Belkin and colleagues, among a number of others, sort of introduced the idea of the double descent phenomenon. This is saying, as I increase the complexity of my network, what I tend to see is a initial sort of classical regime where you get this nice U shape between complexity of a model and generalization performance, but then also this new modern regime where you just make things better and networks work even better. So can we understand this double descent phenomenon? First, I want to just sort of crystallize this phenomenon so that you can see it happening in practice. Suppose you're training a network to represent this sinusoidal target function, and I just give you the 10 samples that are highlighted with circles here. And I'll use a ReLU neural network, just gets a single scalar as input. For simplicity, I'm just going to have these first layer weights be random and fixed. I apply my ReLU, and then I learn these output weights, start them off at 0, and train them with full batch gradient descent. All right, and the standard story goes something like this. If I had just 2 hidden neurons, I would get the predictions that look like this blue line here. It's just, this model's too simple. Can't possibly fit the training data, let alone get good test performance. But then there's sort of this intermediate level, the Goldilocks position, where you can more or less fit the training data, but the model's not too complex, so it's also generalizing well. And then we all know if you go to a more complex model, things break down completely. Now you're fitting all of the training points perfectly, more or less, but you're between those points, you could be doing rather crazy things. And this is the standard bias variance trade-off between a model that's too simple and a model that's too complex in sort of the classical view of statistical learning theory. But if you've seen this in textbook, what you notice, they never go beyond. They never say what happens when you go beyond the number of inputs. So what if you throw caution to the wind and just run the same code, but with 500 hidden units? Well, it turns out it works beautifully well. So this is bang on the sinusoid, and in fact, works the best of all these different model sizes that we've tried. And if you're a little more systematic about it, you can see that really the only time the test error is terrible is at this point where the number of hidden units matches the number of training examples I gave you. So there's a reason why I chose 10 here. It's the point where the number of hidden units is matched to the number of training samples. So can we understand the basis of this phenomenon? And this has been viewed as quite a puzzle, of course. But I would just like to point out that actually I think it's really, these puzzles have been there in the past, and the conceptual content is not particularly novel now. For instance, support vector machines generalize well even with infinite numbers of features. If you ever used the RBF kernel, you've used a model that corresponds to infinite numbers of features, but you're not surprised if it generalizes well. And the reason why you're not surprised is because of regularization. Right at the beginning, there's always been 2 routes to good generalization bounds. One is through limiting the complexity of the model, like BC dimension. The other is through limiting it through regularization. SVMs generalize well if you find a large margin solution. And similarly, neural networks would generalize well if you find a, for instance, low norm solution. And there's lots of papers stretching back a long time showing that the norm of neural networks weights relates to the complexity of the function it represents. So if there is a puzzle, I think the puzzle is, where is the regularization coming from in the typical training procedure that we have for deep neural networks? And that is a very important and interesting question. So to study this, again, I'll take a little petri dish model. This is work with Madhu Advani. He was a postdoc at Harvard at the time. And what I'm going to do is have a strong assumption about how the data is generated. And this will be important because then I'll be able to evaluate the generalization performance exactly rather than having to rely on a sample from a data set. So to do that, I'm going to have a teacher neural network. It has a bunch of input features. I'm just going to draw those randomly from a Gaussian. And then it's going to run those through a bunch of weights that this teacher network has, W bar. Again, I'm going to draw those from a Gaussian and fix them. And so this will now provide a way for labeling new input examples. And I'm also going to add noise to these labels. All right. So this is a simple model for a generative process. It's shallow. It's also linear. And we're going to try to learn this using a student neural network, also a shallow linear network. So this is really just analyzing linear regression. But it's a simple setting that we'll see still gives some interesting phenomena. So here's the model we're looking at. I'm going to draw a data set of P training examples, where each of these examples just IID Gaussian. And my labels are going to be the teacher weights times those training examples plus some noise. And in particular, we're going to be interested in the high dimensional regime. So this is the regime where the number of examples and parameters is diverging to infinity, but the ratio is finite. And this will let us study the case where you have very little data relative to the number of examples. And in particular, this alpha parameter is a key parameter for you to remember right now. It's the number of samples divided by the number of parameters. This has been intensively studied, stretching back a long time, but I think it really sheds light on this double descent phenomena that we're all interested in at present. All right, so with this student-teacher setting, here's what dynamics might look like. In blue, we have the training error, and in orange, we have the test error. And essentially what we're asking is, how does this test error behave at long training times, right? Can we understand this whole trajectory? Why do we see overtraining, and how bad will this overtraining be? And because I have the generative model of the data set, I can exactly compute this test error. I don't have to sample it. I can compute it once I know the students' weights. All right, so what are the learning dynamics? Well, we can just write down the gradient descent dynamics for this particular case. And they're quite simple, of course. This is just shallow linear regression. And ultimately, we know where learning is going to wind up. Because this is linear regression, it's going to wind up at the pseudo-inverse solution, just the normal equations for linear regression, potentially with some component of the weights that's left over from the initialization if we don't have much data, right? So if you don't have data, then whatever you initialize in the data null space is going to stick around. So we know what's happening at infinite times, but we also like to understand learning dynamics. And to understand that, we can do, again, a change of variables based on PCA of the input data. So again, X is just our data. It's drawn IID Gaussian for a particular data set. And we are just going to do PCA and then rotate things into this principal component basis. And when you push that through, things simplify, and you end up with expressions in that rotated basis where all of the different PCA modes evolve independently. So again, this is a decoupling assumption, which is why things are sort of a decoupling result, which is why this is a useful way to analyze things. And what we wind up with is dynamics expressed in terms of eigenvalues of the random covariance matrix of our data. So let's just look at how this works once you solve that linear differential equation. So this is an expression for the test error in the network, and it sort of has these two pieces that are nicely interpretable. This first chunk is basically saying you're going to forget the initialization. So you can see that it's exponentially decreasing over time, and the speed of the exponential decrease is related to the eigenvalues of the input covariance matrix, which again is just the variance of the input data on this particular principal component direction, the ith principal component direction. And this second term is overfitting noise. So this is exponential approach. It's increasing with time, again with a time constant that depends on the amount of variance in the input data in that direction. But the crucial thing here is that this input data variance also shows up in the denominator. And so if you have a direction with low variance, a small eigenvalue, this term is going to blow up, and the overfitting is going to be extreme. And a final point is that if you have an eigenvalue which is exactly 0, that means you have a direction with no variance in your input data, and you're going to have no dynamics in those directions. So the weights are just going to stay fixed at whatever their initialization is. So what this highlights is that to understand the performance of this algorithm, we need to understand what the typical distribution of the variances in the input data is going to be for the assumptions that we've made, which is random IID Gaussian in the high dimensional regime. And luckily, this is given by the celebrated result from random matrix theory, the Marchenko-Pasteur distribution. And what it gives you is the distribution of eigenvalues for exactly this case in the high dimensional regime. And this is sort of what it looks like. Again, this is the density of eigenvalues. And it has a bulk that lies between an upper and a lower limit, where you get a bunch of eigenvalues that are going to be non-zero. And then if you're in the regime where you have very little data relative to the size of the networks, you're in the overparameterized regime, you also are going to see a spike. So this is a delta function, a bunch of eigenvalues that are exactly zero corresponding to directions where you don't have any data. All right, so with that, with this MP distribution, we can combine that with the solutions to give the dynamical solutions I just talked about, to give sort of an exact picture of how training dynamics unfold in these neural networks. So let's start here over on the right. This is the alpha equals 2 case, where, remember, alpha is the number of samples divided by the number of parameters. So now we have twice as many samples as parameters. This is the classical regime. You've got lots of data. What you see is a bulk that's sort of well separated from zero, so you don't have any really small eigenvalues. And so learning, you're not going to see much overtraining, even at very long times. This gap is relatively small. Things work. Going over here to the overparameterized regime, now we have half as much data as parameters in our model. We still see this bulk that's well separated from zero. So the smallest non-zero eigenvalue is still fairly large. And we have a delta function spike at zero. But those aren't going to cause any overtraining. They just have no dynamics. So you can see that there's a big gap between training and testing, but at least there's not substantial overtraining. And so, in fact, you don't get really terrible overtraining in this situation either. So the only case where things go catastrophically wrong is when alpha is equal to 1, where the number of parameters is matched to the number of examples. And there you can see this model is overtraining substantially and would actually keep diverging off to infinity indefinitely. And so if we're a little more systematic about it, this is as you sweep out from overparameterized to underparameterized, you can see you get this spike at long training times around alpha equals 1. So overfitting is worst at an intermediate amount of data. And initially this is quite surprising. What it's saying is if you had a model that was perched here and you gave it less data, it would move to a point here and you would see less overtraining. And you could also add more data as well. So to go back to those questions I posed at the beginning, this third one was a trick question. Either increasing or decreasing the number of examples will reduce this generalization gap because this is at this alpha equals 1 point where you're seeing this double descent phenomenon. And again, just to highlight why we're seeing this result, first effect is this frozen subspace, so the delta function spike at 0, where you've got a bunch of eigenvalues that are exactly 0. They don't undergo any dynamics, so they have a constant error but no overtraining. And the second reason is that the minimum non-zero eigenvalue is increasing. So you call this the eigengap phenomenon. This is just a feature of high-dimensional statistics where things get better either way you go away from 1. And finally, we saw that initialization was crucial to training dynamics. It's also crucial to testing dynamics if you're in the overparameterized regime in particular. So here's just showing that in the overparameterized regime, because you have this frozen subspace of weights, whatever you initialize there stays there. So if you use large initial random weights, that's going to disrupt your test error. And indeed, when you have a limited amount of data, as we increase the norm of the initial weights, you get a much larger test error. So starting with small weights is critical for good generalization. And you might be wondering if this works in state-of-the-art networks, if you see similar phenomena. There's a lot of work now showing that indeed you see these in sort of modern full-scale deep neural, see these types of phenomena in full-scale models. All right, so to summarize this view of overparameterization and generalization, we've seen that generalization can work well in overparameterized networks, again, because of a combination of interactions between algorithm, data, and architecture. And in particular, one I want to highlight, because it sort of has some practical implications, is you do need to start with small initializations in order for systems to work particularly well in the overparameterized regime. Now, everyone in practice starts with small enough initializations, but I think it's important to say that if you change that, use ridiculously large initializations, it definitely, your networks will not generalize as well. All right, let me close with a few thoughts for the future. Hopefully those vignettes have given a sense of some of the theoretical questions that are out there and simple toy models to sort of think about some of these relationships. One point I'd like to throw out there is, should we be looking for a grand unified theory or a bunch of theories? And I think my view is that deep neural networks are sufficiently complicated that I'm not sure we're going to see a grand unified theory anytime soon. And I think that's okay. Rather than seek something that gives us insight into all aspects of deep learning phenomena, I think we can develop theories that apply to specific limiting simplified cases that sort of illuminate the overall landscape of deep learning. And I like this quote from, again, from Leo Briemann in this nice paper that he wrote. He said, "What is needed is not one hammer, but many different tools along with a sense of which ones to use." So if you're interested in non-convexity and learning dynamics, maybe deep linear networks make sense. If you're interested in representational capacity and nonlinear networks, of course, you're going to need something else. And so just to close with some of the directions that people are pursuing, I think interest in theory is increasing dramatically in recent years, and it's really exciting to see. Deep networks, everything I've been talking about, it's about the interactions between architecture, data, and algorithms, and I think that's going to continue in the future. This is really the core of what we have to understand. On the data side, people are starting to look at much more complicated structures than IID Gaussian. So what happens when you have manifolds? How do those get untangled over the course of a deep network? When it comes to architecture, there's a recent real breakthrough in theory based on neural tangent kernels, where you can give learning dynamics of infinitely wide neural networks and get sort of explicit expressions for those, even though they're nonlinear. It's very exciting. And finally, on the algorithm side, there's been some nice recent work showing the effective switching from natural gradient to SGD. So this over here is dynamics in natural gradient network. You see they're just quite simple, whereas SGD gives you these stage-like transitions that we talked about before. So overall, I'm hopeful that if we continue on this path, we actually will arrive at a fairly useful and helpful understanding of deep neural network dynamics. We'll invent the tools we need to understand them. So if you're interested, here's some of the references I've talked about in this work. In particular, these first two are mostly what I've been talking about. And I'll just end with acknowledgements, in particular, Surya Ganguly and James McClelland, Chaim Sontolinsky, and Madhu Advani. And I'm happy to take your questions.
That was great. That was fantastic, actually. Thank you very much for that. You've been extremely busy, I can see in the Q&A section. You've answered,
yeah, it's a cool format, actually.
Questions. Yeah, it's working pretty well. So what I'm going to do now is just ask some attendees if they want to ask questions live now. We have a little under 15 minutes to just go ahead and put up your hand. We have one, Diganta Misra. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. I was anticipating this talk for a long time. I've been following your work and Ganguly's work for nearly a year now. I have a few questions. So firstly, you replied to one of my questions regarding two same seed networks will end up in the same place. Now you're defining same place to be in terms of loss, but those two might not be the exact same minimas in terms of the landscape. They might be more connected and have the same loss, but they are not exactly the same place, are they?
So yeah, so maybe I wasn't clear. So you can start two neural networks from the exact same seed, meaning their weights start in the same exact configuration. And those two networks, I'm analyzing gradient flows. There's no randomness coming from sampling different examples in different orders. Everything's completely deterministic once you know the starting point. So two networks that start from the same weights must end. In fact, their whole trajectories will be locked together. They never change at all. There's no source of randomness. These are deterministic equations. So what I was showing in those plots are actually two networks with different random seeds. So you draw the weights from a random distribution for these two different networks. It's just the variance of that distribution. If the variance is small, that initial randomness will wash out and they basically represent the same thing by the end of learning. Whereas if it's large, then it can hang around for long times.
Right. Just had a follow-up to that. Was one of my questions that I think you haven't answered yet, which I put on the chat, which is that in terms of spin glass models, which has been highly correlated with mean field theory in neural networks, the phase transition graph is usually dependent on the ratio of the rows and columns of the matrix. But in mean field theory in neural networks, it has been assumed that the neural network is a squared network. So how are the phase transition graphs, also called as the edge of chaos transition graphs, nonlinear? They should be linear if they are squared because the ratio would be 1.
Well, so I mean, they can be nonlinear even for square matrices. I don't think, I have to go double check this, but I don't think the width has a super strong impact. I mean, basically, the way that these ideas run is basically say, suppose you're a neuron in layer L+1. Now you are summing a bunch of weights from the lower layer, right, layer L. And as long as you're summing across a lot of different things, then you're going to get a law of large numbers and you're going to have a roughly Gaussian pre-activation. And so the condition that you look for is that a Gaussian distribution transformed through the nonlinearity has a stable variance. So the variance is propagating through that will go through. And so squareness is not an essential feature of that, right? Because you can just pull out one neuron. All you need is that each individual neuron is seeing lots of random inputs in the layer below it, if that makes sense.
Right, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Next up, Kartikeya, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, hey Andrew, thanks for the interesting talk and thanks for taking the time out to answer in the chat. I know there were a lot of stuff going on, so you might missed a few here and there, but never mind. So following up on something I asked there, so you said, of course, if you start from the exact same point and there's no randomness, you end at the whole trajectory is the same. And if you start from different points and you have these variances that are low enough, you end up roughly at the same spot. What about studying the variance of sampling the data itself? So you start from the same point.
Uh-oh.
Oh, we've lost you. Okay. Do you want to give it another try, Kartikeya?
Yeah, I think I know where he's going, but then he won't hear the.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. I'll say So I suspect he's saying what happens when you are sampling the data using SGD, right? And then you can have additional randomness. Now, it's not something I've really looked at. The only thing I would say is that you will still be constrained to lie within the data subspace. So even when you're doing SGD, all of those phenomena about the frozen subspace that I talked about with a shallow linear network and generalization, it still holds. Yeah.
All right, good. All right, I guess we don't have anybody with their, oh, yes, now Samir, do you want to ask your question? Great, thanks.
Hi, Professor Adriel.
Hi.
And Professor Aaron. Thank you for a great presentation. I have just one question. In any deep neural network, actually, there are two main parameters in each layers. We generate new features by nonlinear activation function. And in training process, when we minimize the cost function, actually we are building this cost function in such a way it should be convex that we can apply their, not convex, sorry, it has derivative actually, which we can apply the first order optimization method. My question is that how is there any method which cost function is not, it has not derivative, but we want to minimize it? Is there any approach for that? And my also other request actually from Aaron, when we leave this Zoom session and we lost all question answering,
Oh, do you?
question answering.
I don't think that should be happening. I think, Nadine, do you want to jump in and just, I think there is a
Just my request that it will be better to keep all of this question answering for us. Actually,
definitely.
Later we can read and.
Okay. We are. I'll open up a Slack channel and share the questions for each lecture.
Okay, thank you.
Those are definitely not being lost. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Should I answer the?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So to the first part of that question, so the first thing is we often use non-differentiable loss functions like ReLU, and we just ignore the fact that it's non-differentiable, and that's actually okay because you just have to generalize things slightly to talk about subgradients, and you're still going to be fine. But you could also have a case where you think something's really not differentiable, like architecture search, where you're searching through discrete, do I add another layer? That's really different. And then I'm not an expert in this, but the approaches are things like genetic algorithms or reinforcement learning agents.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So Solomon, I think you were up next.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. So I have two questions. That's my first question. I would like if you can clarify on large initializations. I'm having difficulty to understand what you mean exactly by that. And the second question is, deep learning speed is highly sensitive to initial conditions. I don't know if you can maybe elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. I think this is very important because we often think of the initialization as a minor detail. And in fact, it controls, if there's a message emerging from what I've shown you, it's that it controls the training speed and it also controls the generalization substantially in these networks. So by large, I didn't tell you how large. You can be more quantitative in specific models, but I think a useful practical definition is if you train two different networks from small initializations, you should see them learn essentially the same thing and perform nearly identically. So there should be no variability in the performance. Whereas if you train them from large ones, you might see them learn very different representations. That's one sort of practical definition. You could also use these results on criticality to sort of set that initialization scale. And then another feature that I often look for is, do you see an initial period where things aren't improving very quickly? Because that's a sign that you're stuck at a saddle point and you're in the small weight regime. And you could get rid of that by using larger weights, but then you're using a very different inductive bias. Yeah, so it has these dual effects. It has a training speed effect, but then it also has a generalization performance effect, where if you start with smaller weights, essentially the data is determining more of the representation, right? If you think of large weights, so the intuition is really, it's dead simple. These are simple ideas. All it's saying is if you start with large weights, you have strong random features there from the start. So it just behaves like a random network. You could think of just have random features all the way through and learn the final readout. That's basically what it's doing. And if you really want to be in the feature learning regime, which might have better generalization properties, then you need to start with small enough weights that the data is really structuring the representations that come out.
That's great. I actually, just to follow up to that, does normalization methods like batch normalization really change the story there?
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
What we've seen in just simulating them is that they take away a lot of the training speed trade-off, but the generalization trade-off is still there.
Interesting.
And I don't I think at least I don't understand that theoretically, but that's what seems to happen.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so next, I guess Diganta has already asked a question. So if you don't mind, I'm going to skip over you, and maybe we'll have time, but I don't, probably not. So Mohammed, do you have your question?
Hi, did you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Andrew, for a great presentation. I just want to ask one question about the growth of deep neural network, which we cannot interpret them easily now, and we must approximate different settings. I want to ask you, could we solve these problems in near future for theoretical manner? My question is focused on its robustness, which we could have. I want to ask if we could have a good solution in a theoretical manner of deep neural network. Could we have a robust network in near future?
I mean, this is the thing about theory. Like, it's hard to specify a time frame, and at least my own view is that we will understand these systems. I really think we will. I'm just not sure it's going to be before the next NeurIPS deadline, right? So it's like, what timescale do you care about? And once we understand them, I completely agree, we will be able to make them better. But I really couldn't take a guess on when the theories will start becoming practical. So far, I think they've only made these very small, relatively small contributions, like, you know, maybe slightly better initializations. But, you know, more or less, I think it hasn't had a massive impact so far. But robustness could be a great candidate. You know, adversarial examples, really understanding why those occur. Yeah, it seems like possible.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we're actually out of time now. Maybe we could compel you to answer some of the remaining questions in the channel, in the Q&A channel offline. That'd be
Sure.
really nice. And I think you're going to be doing a breakout session later on. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah, great.
absolutely.
So for those of you that haven't had enough theory, and I mean, I really find this area, it's not an area I work a lot in, but I find it a really important area and a really fascinating one. So it's great. Thank you very much for the talk. And I guess, Nadine, you can give a quick description of what's up next.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I do see there are a lot of questions left unanswered, but you know that he'll be back at the end of the day, our time, for a breakout session. So maybe we can get those answered during that time. What is coming up now is a very short break, followed by, for the lucky ones that were randomly drawn, a couple of one-on-ones with all of our speakers. So look for your Google Meet for those. And we will reconvene at 1:15 with a live lecture from Will Hamilton. So be back at 1:15, and we will see Andrew again at the end of the day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your attention. Bye.
Thanks. By the way, Andrew, I think 33 questions answered in the online is a record for us. So.
Yes,
Okay.
our record holder.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye-bye.
See you.